The power of Nene's story, its mystical quality, was too much for my 9-year-old self. I felt that if I repeated it to anyone, that magical seed would grow like some scary beanstalk and destroy my whole life. So I just stored it away. I kept it deep inside myself and hid it from the world. And I want to pause here to stress how important it is sometimes to keep our mystical seeds to ourselves. Have you ever had the experience where someone asks you what you're working on and you start telling them, and as you're telling them, it's sort of falling flat as you're describing it? It's losing its magic even as you speak. And I see everybody nodding their heads because you know this. We know inherently in our gut that sometimes we need to keep the magic, the inspired idea, hidden until we can put it on the page. Find the right soil for that magical seed. And that's what I did. So for the next 25 years, I devoted myself to what I am labeling the mundane, the ordinary things in life. Going to school, work, marriage, and eventually children. When the mystical found me again, I was in my early 30s, and in a moment between sleep and wakefulness, I heard a voice. I hate it when writers talk about hearing a voice, because like, how often is that going to happen to you, right? But this happened to me. It was an old female voice, and she said something about the futility of words. It was only a few sentences, but they were poetic and heady, and nothing I would have come up with myself. I instantly recognized them as otherworldly. I knew that voice was mystical. I got up and wrote those few sentences on a piece of paper and put them in my diaper bag. But this time, instead of hiding that seed and stowing it away, I planted it. I dedicated my life to finding out more about that voice. Who did it belong to? Why did she not want to tell her story? The more I thought about it, the more obsessed I became. The mystical quality of those words started infringing on my ordinary life. At first, as I tried to get a feel for that voice and her story, it was a lot like weaving with smoke, trying to create something out of imaginary spools of thread. But before long, I'd created an entire character and an entire world around that voice. I named that voice Seda, which at the time I thought was like Turkish for Jane. And she became one of the main characters in my novel, but I spent long and countless routine, mundane hours writing and rewriting. I scoured history books, primary historical records, diaries, letters, journals. I could tell you what kind of puttees Ottoman soldiers wore on their feet, and how long it took to travel by ox cart from Sivas to Malatya. And when I got stuck and could go no further, I pulled out that old magical seed Nene had given me back in 1983. I took her story and started to weave it with all that I already had on paper. I spent 4 hours a day, 5 days a week for 7 years, creating the world of this novel. That's approximately 7,000 hours. As you all know, when you put 80,000 words or 100,000 words in a Word document, that takes a certain kind of crazy right there, right? You really want to know, is it any good? So is it the kind of book that is a magical portal that invites readers on a journey, or is it some sort of evidence of your craziness, a waste of time, or a doorstop? You don't really know, so you send it to others to see what they think. So that's what I did. I started sending the first chapter, which I spent 6 months on, to every literary journal in this country. There are 43 at the time. I think there's like now 41. And then a few in Canada. And every single literary journal in the Northern America rejected that first chapter. So this could have been the end of my journey. I had followed this voice, I had followed my crazy for years to what seemed like a dead end. I had even taken a trip to the interior of Turkey, convinced my husband to stay in a remote village where they were still burning cow dung for fuel, and getting water from a well. But like I said, the mystical and the mundane just started to blur. I mean, when people asked me why I was going to that part of Turkey, what could I tell them? That I had heard a voice 6 years ago and followed it down a weird rabbit hole that had taken over my life? Because that's exactly what had happened. To end up, after all that, at this dead end was devastating. But I didn't give up. I couldn't. Not because I had a brush or two with the mystical. Not because of the mystical. But because I had spent all those hours reading, writing, and researching this story. The mundane, routine, ordinary hard work of writing is what saved the mystical seeds at the center of this story. You couldn't have one without the other. One wouldn't survive without the other. The mundane work, the routine work wouldn't have existed if I wasn't open to the mystical. And the mystical wouldn't have survived if I hadn't already dedicated 7,000 hours to it. The boundaries between literature and life, the mystical and the mundane, began to blur. At one point, I asked a Turkish friend to read the book and see if the Turkish characters and scenes rang true. And after reading it, she said, "I really like the symbolism of Seda's name." And I said, "What do you mean?" You know, I thought it's kind of a plain Anatolian name. I know Armenians who use it. I know Turkish people who use it. Again, I thought it was just Anatolian for Jane. And she said, "Well, you know, you have a voiceless character who goes voluntarily mute and then later in life does not want to share her story. And you've named her Seda. You know what that means, right?" I said, "No." She said, "Seda means voice or echo in Turkish." I stared at her, totally dumbfounded. I'd been writing this novel for years, conjuring up this woman regularly. I had no idea about the kind of deep mystical currents that were operating just underneath the surface. Sometimes the mystical is there and we, the writers, don't even see it. But it's there, woven into the tapestry of our stories, disguising itself as the ordinary and the mundane. Tonight, I'd like to remind you all to welcome the mystical and the mundane into your lives, to give them equal measure. When the mystical knocks on your door or whispers in your ear, invite it in. Whether it comes to you in a dream, as an audible voice, or simply as a story that moves and inspires you. Be open. Stow it away if you absolutely must, but don't forget about it. Honor it, and water it with your endless routine, with the mundane hours of your hard work. You all don't need me to tell you that writing is really hard, and sometimes mundane and ordinary just as it is mystical. It really is a lot like weaving with smoke. There might not be much there to begin with, and you may be operating on blind faith for a long, long time. But in the end, you'll have woven this big, wondrous basket that holds a little bit of life's wisdom and wonder in it. And that is no small thing.